Okay, shall we take it away, David?
Yep. Yep.
All right. Um, so I'm going to, I chatted with David offline prior to our get together tonight. I want to thank everybody for joining. It's been a while since, I think probably since January since we did this. I'm going to start out, I'm just going to kind of take the gang through. I'm going to share a document here in Google Docs by sharing my screen with you guys, just talking about some new things that have kind of come in the marketplace that are kind of interest or maybe of interest to you. And then David is going to go into a much more in-depth discussion about some really interesting experiments and games he's been playing with new DACs, and I think you've got a preamp. I don't know if you want to talk about that, David, or not, but he's been doing a lot of interesting experiments and things, and he's going to spend the majority of our time this evening kind of just telling you insights he's gained from some of his new cheap and cheerful experiments with DACs and things of that like. So anything you want to add, David, before I just kind of take us into the new gear intro stuff?
Nope. Take it away.
All right. So I'm going to share my screen here with you guys really quickly, and just bring up this Google Doc, and I will make this available. I'll send this to our hosts, David and everybody, so they can distribute this to you, so you can have a copy of it as well. So I
Yeah,
just
I guess
kind
we
of
can
went.
put it on the website as well in the
Yeah,
digital
exactly.
channel, so.
Yeah. So Leslie put it on the website, but there were no photographs. So there's more in-depth information here and stuff like that. So the thing that's been, sorry,
sorry, real
go
quick.
ahead.
I put it on the website, and
Okay.
I need each photo to upload separately is the way the website works. So I didn't.
Yeah, I don't want to do that because that's a lot of work. What I
Yeah.
can do is I can export this as a PDF, and then
Oh.
maybe you could just link to the PDF, David. That would be simpler.
Yeah, I mean, this doc should be world readable, or we can make it that way, so you can just link to this doc directly, and anybody with a browser can open it.
So this is going on YouTube too, so I can also add the link.
Okay, great.
Nice.
Cool. All right. So the thing that's been kind of generating the most discussion lately is this little box that you see here. It's called an Eno streaming system. I don't know why it says RG. It's an RF filter. Let me change that right now. It's basically a choke or a coil of some sort that basically mitigates RF. So it doesn't mitigate EMI. It doesn't do anything about phase noise or leakage current, any of that stuff. It's just an RF filter. And it comes with an attached Ethernet cable that's made by Eno. Eno makes some Ethernet cables. They make a copper and a silver one. This one is fixed at the output end, and then you can either use their Ethernet cable in this RJ45 point or an Ethernet cable of your choice. It's kind of pricey. I based this price off of the price that was on Hans Beekhausen's review, which was about 1,130 odd euro, and I think it probably includes the other cable, because I've seen this, I think, in the UK on websites for about 675 pounds. So I think in the US it translates to around $1,000, maybe $1,100 for this box and cable. And then you can either use it with one of their other cables at the input end, which you see here, and then you would connect this basically to your DAC. So this is basically go between, I imagine, a network bridge and a DAC, or a similar configuration like we've been kind of talking about, a streamer, whatever. And it's basically a choke that basically filters RF. I've heard good things about it. RF does get transmitted on copper Ethernet, so I imagine that it does what it's supposed to. There are cheaper alternatives to doing this, which we've discussed in the past. Certainly an optical system would mitigate RF as well. But there's a review. Hans liked it there. The other product that Hans liked recently, this will definitely fall into the cheap and cheerful category, is this Allo Boss 2 streamer that comes in at 215 euro. And this combines both a Raspberry Pi functionality as well as a DAC. It's got a Cirrus DAC in it. And Hans said it actually sounded pretty good for what it was, for about 215 euro. He said it wasn't too bad. He said he could probably put it in middle part of his system 2 level 2 system, and he'd be pretty happy with it, or near the top of his system 3 level, which is his kind of bedroom system. But he said he was reasonably impressed with it. It separates out the digital processing input in from the DAC section, so they've done some pretty good work in terms of keeping the key parts of the functionality separated, and it's really cheap at €215. So
I think for US dollars, it's less actually if you go to the kind of US
cool
version. So,
and then speaking of this little guy, he used it with 2 different power supplies. He used it with this Allo Nirvana switch mode power supply, which I guess they put there's a lot of information here at the link about the things that they've done to address leakage current and all the problems that are intrinsic to switch mode power supplies. They spent better part of a year on this power supply to kind of address the traditional problems that we have when we use switch mode power supplies with things like streamers and network bridges, etc. So that's something that if folks want to put together a second or bedroom or office system, they could check that out. He also tried this little Allo Boss 2 Digi with Allo's true linear power supply, which again is only about $150, and it supports 2 devices at once. So you can actually connect 2 different devices at 2 different total power output. So this one is at 15 watts, 5 volts, 3 amps, and then a 5 watt at 5 volt, 1 amp. It's only $159. So if you've got some of these smaller devices that don't need a lot of power, these are the 2 leads coming off for each of the 2 different 5 volt connections that it makes. So they're not interchangeable. You can't kind of plug in with a DC barrel plug here, but these do terminate in DC barrel plugs of your choice, whether it's 2.1 or 2.5, 5.5 by 5.5 barrel plugs. The other thing that's been of note is Denafrips, who some of you may know, are making some D-to-D converters. I think what these are basically are just good clocks that kind of go between your network bridge or your streamer and your DAC. Denafrips has a high, medium, low level of specification of these. They've got very good femto clocks in them. The top 2, this Gaia here and the one below, which I believe is the Hermes, use an oven-controlled crystal oscillator. They only support AES EBU, I2S, or optical, things like that out, no USB out. So your DAC would require one of those inputs. Denafrips does good stuff. I've not heard their stuff personally, but I've heard great things about them. I know Steve Guttenberg uses the Denafrips Aries DAC for his reference DAC. Not Denafrips Aries, Denafrips Terminator. John Darko's given the Terminator a great review. So these guys definitely know what they're doing. You can see some pictures here. It's got a toroidal power supply. All the various key aspects for the circuitry is isolated in ways that it should be. There's some oven-controlled crystal oscillators, both in the Gaia and this middle level one, the Hermes, which is only about $1,700. So, and then they've got an entry-level one for only $698. The only distinction I can see here is that this one does not have an oven-controlled crystal oscillator, it just has a better crystal oscillator in it. So it's a reclocker for $700. But these might be things that folks might want to explore if they have some interest. I know for a fact that folks that spend money on things like CyberShaft clocks and stuff for their high-end, DACs and streamers get an advantage from them. So I think that that's what these are primarily doing, is just serving as a higher end clock.
So just a quick question on how the implementation. So you reclock it before the DAC, and then doesn't a DAC have a clock in it? So what happens there?
They get reclocked twice.
So does the reclocking in the first place get changed by the second time?
Absolutely. So what you can do is you can systematically remove phase noise, Larry, which is the principal problem that you have when you have kind of cheaper sources upstream. So for example, that CyberShaft clock I was referring to, people will buy these and put them ahead of their esoteric DACs or their high-end like Total DAC or MSBs and stuff like that. They will basically buy a CyberShaft. It will have multiple outputs, and then you can connect it, say, to your network bridge, your DAC, if you've got a streamer or a CD player that it has a clock input, and it will make them all sound better. So I think that's the market they're addressing here. So, and again, it depends on the DAC you're using, but these may well have higher specification clocks than your DAC does. Again, dependent on the DAC. So I know, for example, Esoteric has sold a separate clock that goes with their, I believe, D01 high-end DAC, and that separate clock is the Rubidium G01, I believe. And so when you put those two in tandem, you get even better performance than just the D01 DAC by itself.
I think this is a little bit of a different approach. If I can, figure it out. I think the problem that this solves is if you have an older DAC that doesn't do internal kind of buffer and reclock like all modern DACs do,
right?
You get some benefit from doing this. If you have a modern DAC that's doing that buffer and reclocking, if it gets a more accurate signal coming in, it's still going to reclock it. And if its reclocking is less accurate than this one, it'll sort of produce a less accurate result than what's coming out of this device. It won't hurt. This device won't hurt in any way, but it won't help. It'd be sort of like running a really fine DAC, the analog output into a home theater receiver that converts everything from analog back to digital again and runs it through its internal DAC before processing things out.
I'm not so sure. And again, watch Hans's video on the top of the line and here's why I say that. He found, you're right, David, in the sense that he found the greatest improvements with kind of the least expensive network bridges, right? So if he like connected it to a Raspberry Pi, he got a bigger difference. He did get a notable improvement when connecting it to a Mytek Brooklyn bridge. So a DAC that's good does benefit from, say, the Gaia. He got less of an improvement when he connected it to his Orlik G2.1 network bridge. So I think you're right, but I think it depends on kind of how good. But even something as good as the Mytek benefited from having this in front of it, but it didn't benefit as much, per your point, as, say, the little Raspberry Pi thing that he used with it.
So it would probably behoove people to know what kind of clock your existing clock is.
Yeah, I think you'd want to kind of understand what the specifications of your clock are and the design and all of that. Yeah. So,
okay, thanks. Don't want to derail anything.
No, that's fine. That's a good question. And David's comment was certainly pertinent and on point. I'll just kind of finish up with this thing. This is the the aptly named IO Systems HFSA1-XS20U. Which is the music server that I have presently in-house here. It's called the Phi Data. And basically it's just a thick aluminum chassis. It's a NAS is what it is. It's an audiophile grade NAS. It's $10,000. It's got an interesting kind of RAID configuration where they've got 4 2-terabyte drives in here, but they're configured in such a way that they stripe it in a certain way to, I guess, minimize the requirement for the power supply to do things that might add noise. I don't want to get into all of it. All I'm saying is that I'm got it in-house for review. I'm going to write a review of it. And basically it just works like any NAS. You can connect it to a network audio player, a USB DAC. Gregory was over yesterday. We listened to it. He thought my home system with my Mac Mini and my current system sounded better than this thing did. So again, it needs 500 hours to burn in. It's not there yet, so it might improve. But it's pretty much, I think, for the high-end Japanese market. Does not support Qobuz, does not support Tidal, doesn't support Rune. It's their own kind of software for interface. It seems a little out of date. The software seems a little out of date in terms of how you have to interface with it, how you have to get music into the listening area where you want to listen. So if you've got like an album loaded in to imagine your iPad divided in half and all your albums are on one side and your playlist is on the right side, and you don't want to listen to the album that you listen to again, you have to kind of hit the trash button, delete that, then move over from the album you want into the new window, and then it starts to play. It's kind of clunky. It just seems out of date. It seems like it's 3 or 4 years out of date.
It's good for the audiophile masochist with a lot of money.
I think it's very much intended for the Japanese market.
Yeah, if you like vinyl and all the work you have to get through playing an album. That's probably what you want this for, the digital domain.
Yeah. So.
Because it's not, what you're saying right now is it's more than just a NAS. It's a NAS with problems.
You know, it sounds pretty good. It's gotten better sounding as I've been listening to it, but it's been quirky. And again, I don't know if it's quirky because it's quirky in of itself, or the fact that my townhome here is a veritable black hole for Wi-Fi, and you can only connect to it via Wi-Fi, right? So you connect it to your network, but then you'll notice the tablet here, and you kind of see the little Wi-Fi icon here, or whatever, this little graphic. It only connects via Wi-Fi to your network. And so if your Wi-Fi, like my place, is iffy, sometimes it connects, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you can connect with the phone and not the iPad, or vice versa. So it's kind of bulky. Anyway, but and then I'll just make a couple music recommendations here real quick. I don't know if you have this, Coleman Hawkins and Frères on Verve. This is available as a DSD, SACD, or Redbook. Wonderful album. Oscar Peterson Trio, need I say more? Yeah. And then this Lynn recording here that I've linked here. Lynn does a great job with making recordings, as you might expect. This is really wonderful. Charles McCarr is conducting the Scottish National Symphony with Charles Pizarro on piano, I believe. It's Paizzaro, I believe that's the pianist's last name. It's a wonderful recording, very high dynamic range. It sounds great, even if it's ripped. So just a couple recommendations there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will turn it over to David.
All right. Hiya, folks. I think I'm going to try sharing my whole desktop, because sharing, I'm hoping that this doesn't send me back in time as a result. Let's see what happens though.
Janet, can you mute your system there for us before David?
I'm not making any noise.
Can you just mute so that David can speak on our? Thank you.
Yeah, sometimes there's a little.
I'm going to mute also. So
delay or weirdness. All right, I think you should be able to see things. Do you see Roomy Q Wizard, Roo, and also Rune? All right, I got one head nod, so I think we're good there. All right, so what I've been playing with is, I bought a while back a number of $100 or so DACs, so I was telling you a little bit about some of those. I bought some more, and then I've got a DAC from Gustard, their X16. That's one of the objectively better measuring DACs that the guys over at Audio Science Review did. And these DACs are interesting because they have, a lot of them are ESS based, some of them are AKM based, but they have different filter settings, and they all sound just a little bit different. And so I wanted to kind of figure out if there's any way that I could do some measurements to confirm that the filter settings were doing what the manufacturer said they were doing. A lot of times you'll get a DAC and it's got 6 or 7 or 8 different filter settings that you can use, and you flip between them and you're like, I'm not really sure I hear much of a difference, or maybe I don't hear a difference at all. One of them in particular that I got from Khadas, this Tone2 Pro DAC, it's a very small sort of credit card sized DAC. I've held it up for you to look at before. It had, I could hear no difference at all in the filter selection. So frustrated, I connected it up to my Focusrite 2i2 audio interface, played some sweeps through it so that I could measure the different filter selections and see if my audio interface could hear any difference. And it turns out there wasn't any difference at all. So I reported the issue to the manufacturer and said, hey, I think your filter thing's busted. And they went back and forth. We went back and forth a few times with troubleshooting. They were asking if I was power cycling it between filter selections, or what else I was doing, or was I, what I was drinking or eating at the time, and that kind of stuff. So once we got through I got through their idiot filter, they were convinced that actually it didn't really work. So they came out with a firmware update to address that. The firmware update was complicated because there are 2 parts to there are 3 parts to the firmware technically, but there are 2 parts that are kind of user addressable. One of them is the microcontroller firmware update, which normally is not kind of something that end users end up having to do. But there were 3 little holes in the bottom of the DAC, and you had to peel this rubber foot off of the DAC and then buy an ST-Link microcontroller device to push firmware code into the DAC in order to be able to get the microcontroller updated to the point where you could use it again. And then you could do kind of a XMOS firmware update, which is a typical firmware update you do for DACs to kind of get it to the right level. So now, all this sounds absolutely ridiculous, but keep in mind this was a $200 DAC that I got for $170 because I was an early adopter. It comes from a company called Khadas, and if you go to their website, let's see if I can open up a web browser without causing my computer to go crazy. Oh, looks like more or less the right one. If I go to Khadas, you're going to notice, I mean, they feature the Tone2 Pro. It's a very cute little DAC. This is really literally credit card sized. But if you look at most of their products, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that they make, right? So you're gonna be in DIY space if you're shopping at a website like this. So you're gonna have to expect that you're gonna roll up your sleeves. You're gonna do some firmware programming. You're gonna do some, futzing around with things. If this is kind of their primary, they mostly made these little Raspberry Pi-like hobby boards, and then they got into an audio application with this board, and people really liked it. So they eventually decided, let's try to make an actual kind of commercial product. But it's their first product that you can buy and just use without having to use a screwdriver to put things together. So there were bound to be some issues. Anyway, it was fun. I flashed my thing, and then I packed up the special tool that you had to use to do this, sent it off to somebody else, and they PayPal'd me for the shipping, and then they're going to send it off to the next person. We're going to kind of do this chain thing. We'll see how far my flashing tool makes it across the United States while people are updating their boards. But fortunately, I went through this experiment, and I was able to verify that the filters work before and after. I wanted to show you how I'm doing this, though, just in case you're curious about the process. I've been using Accurate for digital room correction and then Room EQ Wizard to verify my results for a number of years. And so since I've been using Room EQ Wizard for doing acoustic measurements, I thought, why can't I use it to measure a DAC as well? And if I wanted to, how would I do that? I discovered that Room can actually build a sweep and save it to a file. And you can save it with a timing reference. The timing reference is important because if I'm going to play something into my DAC and then record it using a separate device, I need some way to get the timing synchronized. Otherwise, the recording won't really make any sense. So what it does is it runs this is a sine sweep, right? It runs a really short sort of bleep type sine sweep at the beginning. It's almost like clapping your hands if you're trying to get audio and video to synchronize or whatever. So it does that, adds that to kind of the start of the file. It adds one to the end as well, which I don't understand, but whatever. Maybe that's to compensate for playback speed or something like that. But you can save this thing to a file, and I'll do that now. I'm going to save it as a 32-bit float, just the left channel. And when you're doing this, you want to have the timing reference and the channel match. And I'm only recording one channel at a time. So if I was going to do a right one, I would do add timing reference right, or I'll do add timing reference left. I usually only fiddle with one channel at a time. Things get weird when you're doing things. And then it's important to remember what values you use if you're going to do this. I'm doing 0 to 30K because that just seems about good enough for stuff. I'm not too interested in anything. I can only hear up to about 14 or 15K on a really good day, probably closer to 13. So this is double, an octave above what I can hear. If I figure out an octave above what I can hear is probably good enough. So we'll save this thing out. I'm just going to save it to my desktop, and it's written out a file someplace, presumably. Go to my desktop. There's this file. It's 36 megs or so, right? So the fun thing is you can pull that back into Roux and do some analysis on it. And so I wanted to kind of understand what a perfect DAC looked like, right? So if I write this file out and then I pull it directly back into Roux and analyze it, a DAC can't be better than that. So that gives me an idea of what perfection looks like. And what I was expecting to see was a little bit different than what I got, but that's okay. It's all part of the learning process. The thing to understand about these sine sweeps is that they do have some inherent kind of noise and distortion because we're gradually sort of morphing the sine wave as time goes by. And so that will show up when we do an analysis. So I'm going to import I'm importing the same wave for stimulus and response. This is normally done, presumably the response would be like something that you recorded from a speaker with a microphone, right? So these would be separate things, but I'm importing the exact, I'm using the same thing for a file for responses I'm using for stimulus, just so we can kind of understand what perfect looks like. So I'm going to do that. It's just the left channel. It's going to do some FFT analysis on this thing, and then we can take a look at what we got. So I have it on the impulse side right now. So this is what a quote unquote perfect impulse looks like. You'll notice it's not really perfect, right? There's a little pre-ringing and a little post-ringing. And again, that's because we're doing a sine sweep. We're not doing a, if I had recorded a single sine wave like at 1 kilohertz or whatever, then this would look probably a lot more like a perfect impulse. But since this is a sweep, it's going to look a little bit different. If I want to look at step response, I can overlay that, and we see, you know, we go straight up and over. That's what a step response should look like. We have response, since this is a digital file, we have response down to DC. So the step doesn't kind of curve down, it just goes straight across, because, you know, we can do DC in theory digitally. You can't do that in real life. You can't constantly pressurize a room, otherwise it would explode after a while, right? Anyway, so let's take a look at the frequency response. Yeah, frequency response looks pretty good. I'm zoomed in to just a single dB of vertical scale from bottom to top. So this is pretty tight. We're looking at only like, you know, 0.05 of a dB for these markings here. You can see there's a little bit of variation at the lower end. And again, that's because we're doing a sine sweep. So we don't have enough samples at the lowest frequencies for that to look perfectly flat. But this is as good as a DAC could possibly be using this as a stimulus file, if that makes any sense, right? Other limitations for which I'll get into are the response of the analog to digital converter in my device. But it turns out A to D converters tend to be pretty good. They're not as many limitations as D to A converters, so you can get by with that a little bit. We'll take a look at distortion. If I kind of fit the data, I was expecting the distortion to be like absolute zero. There'd be no distortion because I'm reading in a digital file that I created. But it turns out, again, there's some very low distortion down here at, you know, below 140 dB below the, this is my signal up here. So 140 dB below, there's kind of some distortion. And I don't understand the mathematics behind it, but my theory is that unverified, and somebody might know this stuff better, but my theory unverified is that this just has to do with the fact that we're running a sine sweep and we're changing that the frequency of that sweep over time, and so that inherently distorts the signal over time a little bit. But this is if we had a perfect DAC, this is what a perfect DAC would look like. We've got an impulse and step response that looks like this. We'd have distortion that, at least for a range that we care about, let's say just kind of, you know, from 20 hertz to the highest, you know, Redbook CD, we, you know, in a floor of minus 120 dB. We'd like to see kind of nothing in here for a perfect DAC. So this was the first part of my study, was how do we figure out what a perfect DAC looks like. So if I go back to my desktop, let me open one of the DACs that I was playing with. This SMSL Sanskrit 10th V2, at the time that I bought it, it was on sale for 99 bucks. I think because the AKM factory blew up and it's an AKM based DAC, its price on Amazon's been steadily going up. I think maybe it's around 140 bucks now. But let me pull in this DAC so we can take a look at what it was doing. The first thing we're looking at, let me reset my limits here, are the different filter settings. So it has a little remote control, and you can choose, you know, different filters to get a different sound. And I thought, well, this must be it. This must be why we have a preference for different filters, because look, the frequency response is kind of significantly different. Look how much roll off. I mean, some of these things are. This one rolls off, you know, it's almost a dB down at 10 kilohertz or whatever for this super slow one, and then these other ones have different kind of jiggy marks and that kind of stuff. And so maybe some of that matters a little bit. Maybe some of these are enough that you can hear. But I'm not really convinced, right? I mean, if I zoom out a little bit, let me fit data, and I need to zoom in maybe a little bit more on the vertical side. Wrong way. This is not very fun. Let me reset let me do it this way. Let's just increase this some, but not like that. Cancel. Sorry. Insufficient sacrifice to the demo gods. Minus 9.9 I think, and minus 10.9. And I just want to increase this one to like maybe 20 or something. All right, cool. You know, but I mean, if we zoom out a little bit, I mean, this one's down a couple of dB at 18 kilohertz. I already know I can't really hear very much there. It's down 1 dB at 10 kilohertz. So maybe you'd be able to hear the frequency response of that one versus the others. It might sound a little bit more relaxed. And so if you're listening to music that is super bright or whatever, the super slow filter might make a difference. But probably most people in our kind of tender age are not going to hear too much difference frequency response wise for the other one. So maybe there are some other differences. So I thought, well, let's take a look at the distortion graph and see if we see anything interesting there. That's my perfect sweep. All right, so this is the Scharf filter. We can see that there's a little bit of second order harmonic distortion. It's around 100 dB down, and otherwise everything stays nicely below the noise floor. So the Scharf filter looks, you know, about like what you'd like to have for a digital filter. If we take a look at the slow, there's this massive rise in second order harmonic distortion at around 14 kilohertz or so. It's only like 20 dB below the signal at around that frequency. So I would think that might be audible, or might be slightly audible. It might be at least a little bit annoying if you're sensitive to that and you can hear that high. And I don't know if there's any like reflections that are lower, or just the DAC is outputting kind of more distortion, if that affects any, you know, frequencies lower down. But it was kind of interesting anyway to see that difference. This one's fine. This one, this short slow filter again has this kind of same spike. This one, the super slow filter, this is only like 4 dB below the fundamental at 14 kilohertz. So that seems like an awful lot of second order distortion. And then this one's just got a little bit of second order distortion. So there's a little bit of, maybe a bigger difference in distortion between these two, at least in the high frequencies, than there is even in frequency response. Well, let's take a look at the difference in step response between these two. So again, here's what our perfect impulse looks like. If I take a look at the Scharf filter, we can see that there's, you know, some pretty significant pre-ringing. These are in kind of this is 1 millisecond here. So and they say that human ears are time sensitive down to, what is it, like 7 microseconds or something really small. So this is a lot more than 7 microseconds. Whether this is an audible amount of pre-ringing, I don't know. But even like at 200 microseconds, we're starting to see the pre-ringing build until we get the step, until the impulse happens. And then there's a little bit of post-ringing as well. But post-ringing, I'm not too worried about. Pre-ringing for human beings we tend to be pretty sensitive to that, though, from what I understand, reading some articles and papers, and it makes sense anyway, that in nature, you know, before somebody strikes a drum head, you don't hear the strike, because in nature, you know, things don't echo backwards in time really that often, although there's some theories about that. But generally speaking, you know, we expect to hear that reverberation happen for quite a while after an event happens in sound and in time, but we don't expect anything to happen beforehand. So if something does, that is not going to be a natural experience. So there's I would say, you know, a fair bit of pre-ringing happening here. There's less with this filter, so this filter might sound a bit better. If we take a look at some of these other ones, this one has a lot of post-ringing, but, you know, it seems like it's dialed down the pre-ringing a bit more. So that one might be better. What I found, though, when I was listening to this one, I guess it was this one that I tended to prefer the most, even though it has the most post-ringing, just because it had the least pre-ringing. I'm going to show you another DAC in a second, because I was looking through these to see. But yeah, it turns out that, and I talked to a friend of mine has this same DAC. I was asking, said, hey, you know, if you haven't tried filter selection number 4 on this DAC, you might want to check it out, because it sounds pretty good. And by my measurements, even though it has some post-ringing, it has the least pre-ringing. And he confirmed that he'd gone through all of them, and this was the one that he, over a time, he found that he preferred and felt the most comfort level with. So kind of interesting stuff. Let me remove all of these and show you another DAC. Oh yeah, so I've had the iFi Neo DAC in for a while, and I thought it sounded really, really good. and I took a look at its frequency response plots. Let me switch to this setting here. Let me go back up to maybe 12 or something, just to, you know, the frequency response plots are really, really pretty with this DAC. The output level is a little bit lower for some formats than others, but everything's nice and even. I took a look at the distortion graphs, and the distortion graphs, the different sampling rates. It doesn't have a user selectable filter. It only uses iFi's GTO filter. But you know, the distortion for all these different formats. I think I've got a problem with my upsampling for DSD64 because all the DACs have these kind of weird rainbow distortion things for DSD64, but all the rest of them, the iFi measured really, really well. When I took a look at the impulse response, though, there is a lot of crazy pre-ringing stuff going on, and the step response looks all funky too. So wasn't really sure what to make of that. I need to go back and listen to the iFi DAC now that I've kind of taken a look under the covers to see what its response is. But there's a lot more pre-ringing for the impulse response than I would have expected, and it's, you know, the window is pretty large as far as how much pre-ringing it has too. So kind of interesting. Let me show you that Khadas, that new Khadas DAC that I have, and some of the measurements that I came up with for its before and after. So if I took a look at the filters on this stack initially, and look at the frequency response, it looks like there's only one line. It's only when I separated these that I could see that the response was exactly the same pixel per pixel for every single filter selection. And I did these measurements right before I put the firmware on, and then I did a different set of measurements right after I put the firmware on. Let me remove all these. And I want to show you how.
David, yeah. Just real quick, is this what led you to kind of write into them and say, hey, none of these filters look any different?
Yeah, exactly. So I wrote them and said, hey, one more thing. I'll come back to this. So now you can see the filters have actually a different response. So that was kind of cool. They actually have different distortion profiles as well. So some of these have a little bit more of that kind of Loch Ness looking second order distortion kind of poking up. But nothing significant. It's all pretty low. And then the impulse response for all these things look just a little bit different as well. I'll page through them really quickly. This is the one that I found that I listened to organically and that I like the most. Let me overlay the step response. You can see the step response, there's absolutely no pre-ringing at all. There's a little bit of, you know, kind of in the impulse, there's a little bit of kind of jiggling, but there's some post-ringing, but there's absolutely no pre-ringing. And this one sounds the best to me. The brick walls, you know, not too much worse, actually. I don't know if in a blind test I could tell the difference. It might depend on the music between these two, but definitely this one sounds clearly better than the other one. So at least for me, and it might depend on the individual as well, I'm way more sensitive to pre-ringing than I am to post-ringing. Post-ringing, I might even enjoy it. It might be slightly euphoric sounding, right? But pre-ringing, not good. Let me go and open up this. This is the Khadas different sampling rates before I got it, because I want to show you another complaint that I had with the DAC was that it inverts phase. So if we take a look at the step response, the step response is not supposed to go down. It's supposed to go up. So when they corrected the firmware, that was one of the complaints I had as well. Is could you please, like, you know, fix the phase of this thing? So now the step response goes up the way it's supposed to. So this is another kind of fun thing that you can do if you have an audio interface, is kind of confirm that the DAC does what the manufacturer says that it does. Does your DAC invert phase or not? You can find out. Your ears might tell you, you know, one thing, and you kind of suspect it, but you're able to confirm these kind of things. So I'll show you really quickly kind of how I do this. I've got the Khadas Tone1 connected to my Focusrite right now. I have no idea if I'll be successful in doing a measurement while we're on the call, but I'll try anyway. So what I've done in Rune is I created a bunch of 4 million length sweeps in those RU files, that WAV file that I showed you that I generated. I created a bunch of those, and what I did is I just used an external like dB power amp tool to resample those to different sampling rates. And the reason that I did this was because I need, from an analog perspective, for time duration to match up, I need these sweeps to match what Room EQ Wizard's expecting. So it's expecting a sweep that is the length of 4 million and from 0 to 30 kilohertz at 96 kilohertz. And my DAC and my audio interface is only capable of PCM. It can't do DSD. It's only capable of sampling rates from 44.1 to 192. I chose 96 as kind of a middle of the ground as far as its performance goes. But I wanted to be able to send the DAC all kinds of different sampling rates and have the length of it match what Ru's expecting when it does the recording. So that's why I created this file, and then I just resampled. The DAC will play these things, but from an analog perspective, my audio interface is just going to think that it's getting a sweep from 0 to 30 kilohertz at 96 kilohertz. That's all it's going to think that it sees. So I'll go in here and I'm going to do a measurement. If you've not used Ru before, usually first thing you do is end up kind of specifying what your audio interface is and the sampling rate and all that kind of stuff. Once you do the basic setup, though, you can take a measurement. I've turned off like all the different calibrations for my DAC. I can't do an end-to-end loopback calibration because I would need a DAC that is absolutely perfect in response to measure to build a calibration filter for my A to D. I don't have a way to do the A to D without going through a DAC that's flawed, including the one that's built into the unit. So I've just turned that off for now, which is why all my response curves kind of have that upside down horseshoe type of shape. That's just the natural frequency response of the A to D. But I'd rather leave it that way than try to mess with it. Every time I tried to tune things, it just ended up being worse. You can put some comments in here about what you're going to measure. I'm not going to worry about that. The main thing is to make sure that the sweep size and the frequency range all match. So I'm using 4 million as the length and 0 to 30K, and the sampling rate is 96 kilohertz. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the recording here, and then I'm going to pick a file here and just say play. And if I go back here, we'll see that we'll get that kind of timing reference there. That's what we see first. And then RumiQ Wizard is going to recording. So it's the signal path is Rune is playing USB out into this little Khadas Tone2 DAC, and then analog out of the DAC into my audio interface. Then the audio interface is recording this sweep. You might hear a little bit of the sweep in the background because I have the sweep playing out of my MacBook Pro built-in speakers, but it needed to go someplace, and so that's kind of where I've sent it. But I'm not actually recording. Normally with RumiQ Wizard, you have a microphone and you're playing the sweep out of your speakers and you're recording the microphone. In this case, I'm just recording the DAC. I'm not doing any acoustic measurements, but you're still able to kind of use the software in that way. So we'll do the analysis and see. Let me go back to SPL, and we can reset the limits. Yeah. Oh, I was going to change this back to like a 10 here. There we go. So this kind of horseshoe shape is probably the natural frequency response of my analog to digital converter. This DAC might roll off a little bit, but I don't think it rolls off that much. But anyway, this is like 1/10 of a dB, so whatever. It's not a big deal. This is with the first filter, whatever Khadas calls the first filter. But I can go through and change the filters and get a completely different measurement as well. So this is kind of how I was comparing them. If we take a look at the impulse, this first one has a little bit of pre-ringing. If I take a look at at this windowed response, so it's not the DAC setting that I prefer, but it sounds pretty okay. And then I can take a look at distortion and see what's going on there as well. So this actually worked while we were doing Zoom. I'm quite impressed with that. Anyway, so you can do the same kind of thing yourself. You'll notice that I'm doing a full kind of end-to-end test because I'm playing the sweep from Rune in recording it into Ru. And this is what I do acoustically for my when I'm building filters for my listening room as well. Once I'm all finished with this third-party software called Accurate to build the filters, and I get the filters installed into Rune, then I want to play the filters out using my normal DAC and record them in my room using RumiQ Wizard and verify that the results that I get match what the software predicted. All these softwares like DAC and other things, they'll say, look how awesome your room's going to look after you do all these equalization. And that's great that they show you this predicted response. But I want to know, really, take that piece of software out of the loop and let me just independently measure. I listen to music on Rune. I don't listen to music using their weird software. And I listen in my listening position where I put the microphone. So what am I actually getting when I play the music through my DAC using Rune and what actually shows up where my head's going to be. And this allows you to kind of independently verify that stuff. So I also tried doing this to do some measurements with preamps. I have a topping pre-90. It's a little $600 preamp that's here. And I was trying to do some objective measurements to compare that with a Parasound JC2, which is a much fancier preamp, about a $4,500 preamp. And I wasn't as successful. I think that my little audio interface is not sufficiently powerful to resolve any kind of significant objective differences between the two. There's a tiny bit of difference in frequency response, but really kind of nothing else that I could measure. I need like a $28,000 audio precision thingamabob to do that. And for what I get paid doing this kind of stuff, that's not really something that's going to happen. But yeah, so, it was interesting to me. So when I set off on this journey a while back, I assumed that what I saw in the frequency domain, kind of amplitude domain for all these different DACs, that's what would differentiate them in my mind, and that I would, whichever DAC had the best frequency response was going to be the DAC that I preferred. Let me show you one of my ancient hi-fi DAC. I just thought that, if it had a good frequency response, then I was going to be very happy. I don't know where things are in here. Different frequency response curves or whatever. So if it had a good frequency response curve or big frequency response, I figured that was what made me happy. And then I thought, well, maybe distortion's kind of a more important thing. And this DAC, has different amounts of distortion depending on what sampling rate you feed it, which I also thought was interesting, right? Some DACs maybe have a sweet spot as far as sampling rate goes. And so if you want to upsample everything if you can figure out what sampling rate a DAC sounds best at, maybe that has the lowest distortion or whatever, then you could upsample to make the DAC as happy as possible and get the best sound. And so I thought maybe distortion was the main thing. But where my journey has kind of led is that getting things right in the time domain is what makes the DAC sound the best. So if you can if you can find a setting or a sampling rate or whatever you have to do, whatever you have to feed the DAC, and however you have to configure the DAC so that you minimize all this kind of craziness that can happen on the front end from a time perspective, then you end up, it seems like, with the most likely path to listening happiness, without kind of pulling your head out, right? We get into this audiophile nervosa mode where we're second guessing ourselves about whether one thing sounds better than another, or we go back and forth. And sometimes, depending on how many cups of coffee you've had that day or whatever, nothing sounds great or everything sounds great. And so human beings there are other things, outside influences that change the way that we perceive things. And so it's nice to be able to spend $150 or $100 on an audio interface and kind of see what's going on and get that objective warm fuzzy that what you're hearing actually correlates to something that's repeatable and semi-scientific, I guess. So that's pretty much all I had to share with you. You can see this is an older DAC that's quite a mess from a time perspective. That it works at all is impressive. But yeah. Any questions?
Yes,
is anybody still here?
I'd like to lead off with just two broad questions. The first one is, or one's a statement and one's a question for you. I'm not at all surprised that your conclusions about what's going on in the temporal domain is what you found to be kind of most noteworthy in terms of kind of, which one you prefer to listen to, or whichever one was the one that was, kind of most natural sounding, I guess. I'm not surprised that I think that our brains, again, I'm not into a lot of what, ASR does, because I don't think that ASR is actually measuring the correct thing, except potentially for what you've hit on, David, which is the timing thing. I do know that I heard somewhere that our brains are sensitive to things like the impact of phase noise and timing errors easily into the nanosecond time domain and possibly into the picosecond domain, which is why we have femto clocks, which is one order of magnitude even, better than that we can hear, timing errors in the picosecond time domain. And my question is, of your DACs, which one do you like listening to the most?
Yeah, it's one that I haven't measured yet, and actually I'm a bit terrified now to measure it because then I might discover that I'm an idiot. But that's okay. Sometimes it's better to just live without it. But right for now, the Gustard X16 is by a mile the best sounding DAC that I have. That one was about $500. So it's also one of the things that I promised myself that I would never do is never spend more than $500 on a DAC ever again. I did that once with a Wired for Sound DAC 2 thing a decade or so ago, and it was a fine DAC, but it was absolutely within 4 years of my purchasing it, it was absolutely destroyed by a DAC that cost much less, and that's kind of the way, like, just kind of the way things go for DACs. It seems like they're sort of like smartphones, and so, do you really want to spend more than $1,000 on a smartphone that you're going to replace in 3 years? For DACs, it ends up being kind of the same sort of thing. Yeah, the Gustard, the topping, or this Khadas Tone2. I'll unplug it so that I can show it to you again. Yeah, this is this little tiny. It's a little credit card size DAC. It does have that kind of balanced RCA thing. So it looks like an RCA to XLR adapter, but this is actually a fully balanced connection. So you can get a full 122 dB of dynamic range or more out of this thing, just with this balanced connection. So I've been going balanced into my audio interface. I don't know if this thing will focus well enough for you to see the ports, but you can see online. It's going to focus on me because it thinks that I'm more interesting. But you can look online to kind of see how they've open sourced this balanced RCA design. And the only reason they did it for this is because the DAC's too damn small to actually put an XLR jack on. And they could do mini XLR, but that's kind of like pro audio tweaky. So they decided to go even more tweaky with something that nobody else does. Anyway, but I'll put a link to that so that you can take a look at it.
While you're doing that, didn't you get a balanced, wasn't one of the DACs or preamps that you got balanced so you could use it, in fact, in combination with that DAC? Is that correct?
Yeah, so the Topping 390 has is a preamp that has 4 balanced inputs and 2 single-ended inputs. So I can connect 4 balanced DACs to it if I can find all the cables and switch among them and kind of A, B, C, D them and compare them. I don't really find sort of quick A/B comparisons to be super useful because all these things sound so similar. One thing that I found, I thought that I could hear all kinds of differences between them, and then I got out my trusty dusty audio interface again and I measured sweeps and I matched them all to within 1/100 of a dB, which you can actually do. It takes some time, but I could match them. I could use Roon's volume leveling thing and all other kinds of stuff to match them all to within plus or minus 1/100 of a dB, and then it was really hard to hear a difference. In a quick A/B type of thing. Where I noticed that I hear a difference in a DAC is kind of like the stuff that we've all talked about before, right? Where you put a song on to just kind of listen to, how the DAC is sounding, and you end up listening to the whole album because you just can't stop yourself. And that's when you know that you've got things set up right, that you've got a filter that you like, that there's good synergy between the output impedance of the DAC and the input impedance of whatever you have it connected to. That you actually like the music and that you had something for breakfast that made you feel good that day, that all those kind of things line up. But yeah, this DAC is objectively, it's about as good as anything that I've measured so far, and it's only $200. You can run it off of your smartphone, although you better have a big battery because it'll drain the battery in your smartphone kind of fast. But it will connect up to an iPod or an iPad, so an iPad or an iPhone or an Android phone. It'll play, it's a full MQA decoder if you care about that. I think most of us care less about it now than we did before, if that's possible. But anyway, it has a lot of processing power in it. So it'll do it kind of ticks all the technical boxes as far as that kind of stuff goes. So for a cheap and cheerful DAC, it's fun. If you're ever, we can't travel now, but if, I guess once COVID's over, you could travel and take this thing with you and not really feel like you were missing out on very much on the road with this thing. But the Gustard is better but just by a hair.
So when I was interviewing Lucas Ficus of Lampezator for my review, one of the things that Lampezator doesn't disclose is what the DAC chip is. any of the digital stuff, like whether it's even Delta Sigma or R2R or ladder or multi-bit, they don't even talk about it, right? And he said, look, there's more difference in the transistor that I decide to put in a specific position in the circuit in the analog section than between any DAC chips. And he said, so I don't even go down that road of discussing these things, because at the end of the day, it simply does not matter. I can change out a transistor later on that will make a much bigger impact than what DAC chip I have up front of it.
Yeah. That does seem to be the case. I think the only comment that I might add is that like I said, the filter selection seems to make a difference. The Gustard only has 3 filters, even though the chip that's inside it has more. They only expose 3 filter options. So that's kind of interesting. I'm not really sure why they didn't expose all of them, but I have established a personal preference, and like I say, I'm somewhat terrified to measure it and find out how full of crap I am. But nonetheless, the place that I bought the Gustard DAC from which was Appos, they're here in Santa Clara. They don't sell it anymore. I don't really know why, but you can Google it and find other places that do. I'm hoping that they'll add it back to their list of things that they import, because it's pretty nice. They make a matching headphone amplifier as well that got some pretty good reviews, although apparently the I guess it's the 6.3 millimeter plug is very grippy, so you could like literally lift the amplifier up from a cable that's plugged into it. It's not going to come loose. Apparently it's a little snug. If I tried measuring a much more expensive DAC? No, like I said, I promised myself I would never buy another one. I did have the shit audio Yggdrasil thing in my listening room for 3 or 4 weeks. It was brought over by another audio club member, just to listen. I'm not really sure why he trusted me with that, but whatever. And this was before he didn't have it upgraded with all the kind of new fancy USB things that they had. And it sounded really, really nice. But it didn't sound like 5 times as nice as the DAC that I was using before we put that in. So I ended up deciding not to actually buy it. But yeah, and I know that was when one of our shootouts, Larry, that we had in the club a couple of years ago, I guess, along with kind of 10 other DACs or 9 other DACs, most of which were quite a bit more expensive. But yeah, I haven't tried measuring. At some point, I'd like to get like that RME. RME makes a $2,000 kind of audio interface thing that essentially they designed so that you could use it to measure other DACs. I don't know if my hobby is going to take me in a $2,000 direction to make that investment, but I could probably get much more interesting information out of that than my $150 Focusrite thing. But part of the point of this is that you don't have to spend a lot of money to kind of validate what you're hearing from your DAC, and that, we assume that all DACs are so good that they all sound alike, or that's what a lot of people say, but there are pretty obvious differences between all the DACs that I've tested and between all the different settings of all the DACs that I tested, and even how the DACs perform with different sampling rates. That changes to some extent. So pretty interesting stuff. Fortunately, the Tone2 varied quite a bit with some of the other sampling rates. Like if I sent it a 352.8 or 384 kilohertz signal, there was loads of distortion, and I could hear the distortion, which is part of the reasons that I measured it. So I said, hey guys, this is awful. You have to fix this. That's one of the things they fixed in the firmware update. But like, that's a surprising result. You would think that if you upsample more, you'd get more better stuff, and not with this DAC. It was awful at that sampling rate. Weirdly, at 705.6 whatever or 768 kilohertz, those ridiculously high sampling rates, it was fine. It was just at 352. So there's just like, all these things are computer things. They all have bugs, and so you just have to kind of inspect them and see if you're getting what quality you were promised.
So I had a quick addition to a very inexpensive DAC streamer. I put a link to it at the top of the chat.
Okay, cool.
I have a living room system that's just for background music. It's hooked up to an old Yamaha receiver and some speakers in the ceiling. So this thing was 65 euro, whatever that is. I think it's around 80 bucks or something. but it's a root endpoint. You can hook it up to Roon. I guess you have to activate it with your Wi-Fi first, but once you do that, it's worked flawlessly. It's a lot less involved than, say, a Raspberry Pi for setup and that kind of thing. So anyway, just thought I'd share that.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. $65. I don't know that I could do much better building something. So
Larry, that's just a streamer. It's not a DAC, or it's a DAC as well.
A DAC streamer does just 2496, so it's not high res or anything.
Yeah, it looks like it's Wi-Fi in and analog out.
Correct. Yeah.
Pretty
The
interesting.
mastering that matters the most anyway. So
It is, absolutely. Yeah, and then if you haven't watched, what was that guy's name? Golden something another? The MQA debunking thing? Gold. I should have mentioned this in the start. Golden Sound. If you haven't watched this, his crazy thing that he did on kind of reviewing and analyzing MQA, I'll put a link in the chat as well. It's worth the 20 or so minutes. First of all, his production quality and communication is really, really good. But essentially, what this guy was trying to evaluate MQA to see if it met any of the claims that MQA did, and I think most of us know that it probably doesn't. But the hard part is you can't just like open up Adobe Audition, record something, and then save it as an MQA file. That's not really an option, right? Consumers don't have access to the encoders or whatever, and there's all kinds of complicated reasons why they claim that's the case. But what he did was he actually can produce some of his own music, and he had the ability to produce music and upload it to Tidal to have them release it and publish it for him. So he said, let me just use that and publish some test tones. So I'll publish some full sine sweeps and some impulse responses and what different kinds of test tones. And the Tidal said, oh, the MQA encoder won't work with these kinds of files, so we can't do that. So he said, fine, you recorded a longer piece, but then like those movie clips where they put like a frame or two of a bucket of popcorn or a subliminal message, a Coke or whatever. He recorded a longer piece, but then he had like little, a second or so every once in a while they would have like a sweep or an impulse or whatever that he just kind of snuck into the file. So he published those, and then he was able to play them back on an $1,000 iFi Diablo DAC that does MQA and get some measurements about what the actual objective performance of MQA was. And he found some, so that was pretty clever. And he found some pretty significant issues with MQA, especially in the time domain. So it's worth your time to watch if you're curious about MQA or not. The MQA guys were pretty unhappy with him for doing that, and had his account removed and banned and all the rest of that stuff. And
good.
It won't surprise me if they sue him or break his kneecaps or whatever at some point. So he was slightly brave in doing this, but nonetheless, I think it was interesting results. The thing that my reaction to it was there are some obvious problems. A lot of them are in the higher frequency range, I guess. And the sad thing to me about it is that in spite of all of MQA's problems, it doesn't really sound terrible to me. I wish it sounded worse based on all the kind of FUD that's out there, but I don't know that I'm a fan, but I don't hate it so much that I'm going to go rush out and cancel my Tidal account, I guess. There might be other reasons why I should do that, but that MQA sounds terrible to me is not one of them yet. So you have to, at the end of the day, you have to remember we do this for enjoyment. And so if you're enjoying what you're hearing, then don't feel shameful about listening to MQA. I'm not going to anyway. So
I know that in my case, my biggest question is often having to do with absolute phase. I know people who can spot music that's completely out of phase, and me, I jump back and forth between in phase, out of phase, won't know the difference. They'll try to point out exactly what to listen for, and I still won't hear it.
I think on headphones, I can tell the difference somewhat reliably, slightly better than 50%, but with speakers in a room, I have never been able to hear any difference in phase. And I think speakers with passive crossover networks have so many weird phase issues that you'd have to have some really nice speakers to be able to hear a difference. But with headphones, I think you have a sporting chance at it. Anyway, we've gone a bit over. I appreciate everybody's questions and thoughts and all that stuff. Hopefully my charts and graphs weren't too boring or whatever. That it was, you learned something, and maybe you can, if you reproduce any of that on your own at home, I'd love to hear about it. Just
Oh,
because.
I have one follow-up question for you, David.
Yeah.
I'm just curious if you've ever explored this or not, but a lot of people like the AudioQuest Dragonfly, the little plug-and-play DACs. Have you ever played around with those or listened to them?
I haven't. The Cobalt seems to be pretty popular, and it's come down $100 in price since it was released.
Oh, really? Okay.
So there's that. They're limited to 96 kilohertz, which is fine. It's just that you can buy an iFi DAC that plays all the formats for a bit less, and it has a battery in it. So like for my portable use case, I like to have a DAC that has a battery so that my phone doesn't immediately run down. Right. And the AudioQuest ones didn't sort of tick that box, I guess. So I was never curious enough to actually buy one, but I've never heard anybody say they hated them. So I mean, I think for what they cost and what they do, they're a good value.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if Gordon Rankin's, kind of expertise in this area, would kind of be something that, was discernible in your tests or whatever. I don't know if I got a chance to ask, but so I guess I did ask this, of the DACs that you bought, you like the Gustard the best, is that right?
Yeah, the Gustard's a clear winner.
Yeah.
And it's very satisfying. It's very heavy. It's small, but it feels like it's just made of like solid rocks or whatever. I don't know why. Maybe they just put like a brick in there or something. But there's something satisfying. There's something satisfying about an audio component that has some heft to it.
Yeah. I agree.
I don't know what it is, but
it's like my VPI bricks.
But yeah, it's amazing what the DAC that you can get, the source that you can get for under $500, which is my ceiling right now, and probably will be for as long as I'm doing this, I guess, is just staggering. It's really awesome.
That's the nature of digital.
Yeah.
Well, just to add another little log to the fire here. I've been sea ranching again, and I brought my Manly tube amp up here, and the preamp, the amplifier that I have, the Onkyo amplifier that I've been using, does not have a pre out, so I can't use that as a preamp for this. But I have this Project S2 Digital, or what they call it. It's got a very strange name.
It does.
Project Pre S2 Digital or something. But anyway, it's a DAC and it's a preamp, and it drives this amplifier. I've been using, of course, I think you guys know I've been using my iPhone or an iPad as my digital source. And between that and the project device, it drives the amplifier just fine. And it's I think that when I got it, it was like $300. I think it's now $500, something like that. So it's gone up a bit, but it does all the formats as well. I've seen, I think it won an ESO award a couple of years ago.
Yeah, no, it's a good little DAC. I've got a number of friends who have that. When you're messing around with filters, they recommend filter number 1, but I would skip through them and try the hybrid fast filter. I think it's the second to last one. Okay. That one seems to have less pre-ringing, so it might be interesting to see if you establish a preference for that.
I'll check that out, yeah, because the reviews I read said that they couldn't hear any of the difference between any of the filters, sort of like what you said about that one.
Yeah, I haven't measured the filter response, but assuming that the filters do what they say, based on my other ESS measurements, that one might have a little bit less pre-ringing. I've got a friend who has one. I'll have him bring it over and I'll measure it, and I'll share the results with you guys on the website.
I'd be interested in what you find.
Yeah.
Have you tried the shit Modius?
I haven't, but holy smokes, for $200, the objective performance of that is ridiculous. There's no USB input, right? It's only SPDIF, but if you need an SPDIF DAC, and you want it to sound good and be made in America and reliable and awesome, and meet all of Amir's check boxes as far as performance goes, and you want balanced outputs, I really don't know what else you would buy. It's just crazy.
I thought it was a micro USB.
I think
it is.
Is it? Yeah. Oh, does it have USB as well?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah,
sure. I thought it was. When I looked at it, I didn't notice the USB port, so I was like, well,
so
I guess
tiny
it's
you can't see it.
Exactly, it's micro.
Maybe it's a nano USB port or something. I'm not sure what they're doing.
I'm in the market.
I'll just add something. I had a Bifrost, actually, which Gregory Morgan owns. This was the first DAC I bought from shit years ago. I sold it to Gregory some time ago, but I had my Goodyear multi-bit, and I listened to that for years, thinking it was a really good sounding DAC. And then this whole time, Mike Moffat and Jason are going like, we still don't like USB. We're going to put in our Gen 5 USB. We think it sounds better. But Mike's kind of going like, I'm still not crazy about USB. This was before their USB
Unison.
Beyond Unison thing, right?
Yeah.
So they put out this little device for about a year. Some of you may remember, called a shit EITR, EITR, and it was a USB to SPDIF converter. And so it was like $170. It was to tide people over until Unison came out, blah blah blah. So I bought that thing, and I had I snagged a Shinyata Venom SPDIF cable, and I put that in. It was just, and I couldn't believe how much better my Goodyear sounded with it. It was just like, holy shit. And then I realized Mike and Jason were right all along. USB sucks as an interface. And then I gave it to Gregory, and I said, listen to this with your Bifrost, right? And he waited like, I don't know, 6 months or something. He was busy with other stuff. And then I get this call from him one night. Oh, I finally put that thing in. Oh, that thing I lent you 6 months ago? Yeah, I can't believe how much better the DAC sounds now with it. I go, that's why I gave it to you to try 6 months ago. So he was raving about it. And I think they fixed all of that. I think with their current USB implementation, their proprietary one, they now say you don't need an EITR anymore, right? They fixed the problems with their own implementation of USB. But I was shocked as to how much of an improvement that little device. You needed 2 USB cables for it, of course, right? So I had an AudioQuest Diamond and a Coffee kind of running it at the time, but it just made me really, when Mike Moffat tells you like USB sucks and we don't really like it and we're going to do it because our customers demand it, he was right all along. Now there's been a lot of improvements in USB since that time. We're talking probably 3 or 4 years ago now, but this whole time I thought I was hearing my DAC at its best, and I wasn't even close to it until I put that thing on.
Yeah, so I mean, people in the vinyl world just talk about all the different tweaks you can do and all this different vinyl turntable setup stuff, and external preamps and power supplies for your preamps and all these things. I tell you, in the digital world, there's every bit as many little things, which is why we have this group anyway.
Right.
I had the same thing with the Berkeley. They didn't believe in USB, so they had to produce a separate little D2D converter, which was about $2,000, which I still have and I use with the Yggdrasil. And it makes a world of difference.
Yeah.
And so again, I think everybody has a specialty and knowledge base, and it takes a while, to solve the issues. So
yeah, I would agree.
All right. Well,
what's the problem with the micro USB? Is the wire is so tiny? The cable is too small.
You can't get good cables in micro USB that are worth a damn.
I mean, AudioQuest does make a Diamond that's micro
they do?
USB.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
that's
if you want to spend $1,000 for a micro USB cable,
no,
one available to go with your $200 DAC.
yeah. Everything has to be done in terms of balancing.
Yeah. I am actually using an AudioQuest Cinnamon USB-C cable with the Khadas Tone2. The Tone2, this little guy is USB-C, and so I got some AudioQuest jewelry for it. Not necessarily because I thought it would sound better, but it's also red, and so the two just look stunning together. Some of the audio decisions I make are based on appearance and not any expectation of sound quality improvement. But it can't hurt. So
no, it will. They do matter.
They sound better when they get together that way.
Yeah. If my so it's like food preparation. If somebody just slops the food on the plate, it may not taste that nice. If they put it with like a little lily on the side and the presentation's really beautiful, it's going to taste better. Right?
If there's a lot of real estate on the plate, which is how a lot of food comes today, then you better have good presentation.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what the theory is, but whatever works to make our brain think we're hearing something better, I'm going to go with it. I'm a huge fan of placebo effect. I tell people all the time it's the cheapest upgrade you can possibly get. If your perception, powers of perception tell you, or belief tell you that something sounds better and you don't have to spend a bunch of money to get there, then that's fine. Put a brick on top of your DAC and your brain tells you that it sounds better. Whether there's any science behind it, I don't really care. If it works, it works.
Do they sound better before or after you measure them?
Yeah, that's right. That's it.
That's the problem.
That's the problem.
If you have a bias in one direction or the other, you can get fooled pretty fast.
Right, that's fine. I'm not in this for.
I'm not convinced that we're measuring, except for what David was saying about the temporal stuff. I'm not sure that we're measuring anything that matters in terms of what our brains are perceiving, right? So,
You're right.
you know, our brains are creating music, right? This is like why the two-stroke chainsaw, which pressurizes the airwaves that we hear, right, does not sound like music, you know, and yet a Guarnerius being played by, you know, Arthur Grumio does sound like music. So,
Okay.
Funny
And
old
everything is system dependent or room dependent. So
and brain dependent.
And brain dependent, yeah. And the aging brain actually is probably a good thing.
The sad part is that as the brain gets better, the ears get worse. So I don't know.
Well, yeah, it's a trade-off.
There was a great quote I heard on like one of the you know, not one of the Family Guy cartoon or something. It said one of the characters said, "Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're probably right."
Mm-hmm. True but sad.
Applies to motorcycle racing too. All that. So anyway.
All righty, well, guys, I have to drop off. Everybody, thanks so much for joining. Jay, thanks for recording this and putting it up so that other people can laugh along with us in the future.
Thanks for all your hard work. Very interesting.
Great work, David. Great work. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Until next time, hopefully we'll do something again in May.
Okay.